The dust of FOB Nightingale clung to everything, a fine, ochre powder that settled in the creases of uniforms and the mechanisms of rifles. It was a temporary place, carved into the hostile folds of a mountain range that had chewed up empires for centuries. Master Sergeant Elena Rostova felt the grit between her teeth and ignored it. She had tasted worse. At 58, her hair was more salt than pepper, pulled back in a severe, regulation bun that did nothing to soften the lines etched around her eyes. She moved with a quiet economy, her steps measured, her presence easily overlooked, which was precisely how she preferred it. She was here to manage the logistics for Operation Serpent's Tooth, a task that involved counting crates, verifying manifests, and ensuring the Tier 1 unit assigned to the mission had every piece of high-speed, low-drag equipment their hearts desired. That unit, Cerberus Squad, treated her with an indifference that bordered on contempt. They were young, sculpted from iron and arrogance, their movements loud and confident. They saw her as a relic, a quartermaster clerk who had somehow washed up at the sharp end of the spear. Sergeant Cade Miller, call sign Ares, the squad's breacher and self-appointed alpha, made a show of it. He and his fire team partner, a lanky specialist named Jean Echo Tanaka, were jogging past the supply depot where Rostova was cross-referencing ammunition serial numbers on a datapad. Miller slowed, his sweat-soaked shirt clinging to a physique that belonged on a recruiting poster. "Morning, Sergeant," he said, the title dripping with false deference. "Making sure we have enough paperclips for the big dance." Tanaka snickered, a quick, sharp sound. "Easy, Ares. Master Sergeant Rostova's ensuring the whole op doesn't grind to a halt because you forgot to requisition your favorite brand of protein bar." Rostova didn't look up from her datapad. Her finger traced a line of code. "Your sidearm ammunition, Miller. Lot number 7B4, Delta. It was recalled 2 weeks ago due to inconsistent powder loads. I've replaced it." She finally lifted her eyes, and for a second, the flat, gray stillness in them made Miller's smile falter. "You're welcome." She turned and walked away, leaving them in a cloud of dust and their own deflated egos. They saw a supply clerk, a glorified warehouse manager. They saw her slightly stooped posture, the result of a long-ago parachute landing that had gone wrong, and mistook it for frailty. They saw the wrinkles and the gray hair and saw a woman who should be planning her retirement, not overseeing the logistics of a kill-or-capture mission in the deadliest terrain on the continent. They did not see the coiled stillness in her hands, or the way her eyes constantly scanned the ridgelines surrounding the FOB, assessing angles and fields of fire with an instinct they couldn't possibly comprehend. Her workspace was an organized corner of a chaotic supply tent, a small island of order in a sea of canvas, metal, and testosterone. She worked through the night, fueled by bitter, black coffee, her datapad glowing in the darkness. She wasn't just counting beans and bullets. She was studying topographical maps, weather patterns, and fuel consumption rates for every vehicle in the motor pool. She cross-referenced them with regional hydrology charts and century-old smuggler's maps she had sourced from an intelligence database. To the men of Cerberus, logistics was a service. To Rostova, it was the lifeblood of the mission, the invisible architecture upon which victory was built. And she saw a flaw, fatal one. She marked it on her map, a thin red line in the digital sand, and waited for the morning briefing. The dismissal she knew was coming was as predictable as the sunrise. The briefing room was a plywood box suffocating under the weight of the morning heat. The air was thick with the smell of stale coffee and nervous energy. General Theron Vance stood before a massive holographic map, his presence dominating the small space. He was a man carved from granite, with a booming voice and a philosophy that favored overwhelming force above all else. His eyes swept over the assembled soldiers of Cerberus Squad, landing on them with paternal pride. They were his war dogs, his tip of the spear. His gaze slid past Master Sergeant Rostova without a flicker of recognition. She was part of the furniture. "All right, listen up," Vance began, his voice a low rumble. "Objective is the asset codenamed Prometheus High-Value Scientist, held in a fortified compound here." He jabbed a finger at a glowing red on the map. Intel says a light security detail, local militia. A walk in the park for you boys. He outlined the plan. A swift, pre-dawn aerial insertion, a direct assault on the compound, and a rapid extraction by ground convoy to a primary landing zone 60 clicks to the west. It was simple, brutal, and arrogant. Cade Aries Miller grinned. Sounds like our kind of party, sir. The general clapped him on the shoulder. That's what I like to hear. Rostova cleared her throat. The sound was small, almost lost in the hum of the projector, but in the ensuing silence, it felt like a thunderclap. Every head turned towards her. Vance's eyes narrowed, his brow furrowing in annoyance at the interruption. "Master Sergeant?" he asked, his tone laced with impatience. Rostova stood, her movements deliberate. She pointed a steady finger at the holographic map, tracing the planned exfiltration route. "General, the route you've designated, Route Viper, crosses the Al-Kashir Gorge, specifically the bridge at checkpoint 7-inch. Your point, Sergeant?" Vance's voice was growing colder. "My point, sir, is that the bridge's load-bearing capacity is rated for 10 tons. The combined weight of 2 armored MRAPs and the support truck exceeds 25. Furthermore, satellite imagery from O400 this morning shows significant erosion at the eastern abutment from the recent flash floods. The bridge won't hold. The convoy will be trapped in the gorge." A ripple of smirks went through Cerberus' squad. The supply clerk was trying to teach them tactics. Vance's face hardened into a mask of contempt. "Master Sergeant, your job is to count the bullets, not to plan the battle. The intel on that bridge is 6 months old. It's fine. I trust my tactical planners over your inventory reports. With respect, sir." Rostova's voice remained level, betraying no emotion. "Hydrology isn't an inventory report. It's physics. The route is a death trap. There's an alternate path, an old service road 17 clicks to the north. It's rougher terrain, but it's solid ground." The general took a step towards her, his 6'4" frame looming. "Are you questioning my command, Master Sergeant? I am presenting a logistical analysis to prevent mission failure and loss of life, General." The air crackled. Vance wanted to humiliate her, to put the clerk back in her box. A cruel, mocking smile touched his lips. "You seem to have a lot of opinions for a logistics NCO. In my day, soldiers with that much tactical input had a call sign. What do they call you in the supply depot? The crate counter? Boxcar Betty?" The young soldiers snickered openly now. Miller leaned back in his chair, thoroughly enjoying the spectacle. Rostova's gaze didn't waver. Her face was a placid lake. "Master Sergeant Rostova is sufficient, sir." "I'm sure it is," Vance sneered. He turned his back on her, dismissing her as thoroughly as he had her warning. "Cerberus, you have your orders. Route Viper stands. Get it done." He strode out of the briefing room, the sycophantic silence of his command staff trailing in his wake. As the Cerberus soldiers filed out, Miller paused beside Rostova. "Nice try, Grandma," he whispered, his breath hot and condescending. "Stick to your spreadsheets. Leave the real work to us." Rostova said nothing. She watched them go, her gray eyes holding a deep, cold sorrow. She returned to her datapad and pulled up the alternate route, the old service road. She began calculating travel times, fuel consumption, and potential ambush points along the path she knew they wouldn't take. She did it anyway, because logistics was about planning for every contingency, especially the ones born from arrogance and pride. She then walked to a locked container at the far end of the supply depot, a container whose manifest listed its contents only as archived meteorological equipment. She keyed in a long, complex code. The heavy doors hissed open. Inside, resting in a custom-fitted foam case, was a rifle that hadn't been on any official inventory for 30 years. It was an old friend, and it was immaculate. The initial phase of the operation was flawless, a testament to the brutal efficiency of Cerberus squad. They fast-roped from helicopters into the pre-dawn gloom, shadows detaching from shadows. The assault on the compound was a symphony of controlled violence. Suppressed rifles coughed, Doors were breached with explosive force, and the militia guards were neutralized before the alarm could be fully raised. Within 15 minutes, they had the asset, a terrified scientist named Dr. Eris Thorne, and were loading into their waiting vehicles. See, Miller's voice crackled over the comms, brimming with cocky satisfaction. A walk in the park, just like the general said. They rumbled out of the compound, 2 heavily armored MRAPs and a support truck, kicking up plumes of dust as they turned onto the designated exfiltration path, Route Viper. In the Tactical Operations Center back at FOB Nightingale, General Vance watched their progress on the main screen, a smug look on his face. Rostova stood in the corner, a silent, ignored sentinel, monitoring a secondary screen displaying thermal imaging and seismic data from the region. The convoy descended into the Al-Kashir Gorge. The canyon walls rose steeply on either side, sheer cliffs of ochre rock that seemed to press in on the vehicles. The road narrowed, winding along the edge of a precipitous drop. Jean Echo Tanaka, riding in the lead MRAP, felt a prickle of unease. "Command, this is Cerberus 1, he reported. "Gorge is tight. Visibility is limited. Looks different from the recon photos. Proceed as planned, Cerberus." Vance's voice boomed back, dismissive of the concern. They reached the bridge. It was a simple, ugly structure of steel and concrete, spanning a 50-meter gap over a dry riverbed littered with boulders. Even to the untrained eye, it looked wrong. The concrete on the far side was cracked and crumbling, and the entire structure seemed to sag slightly in the middle. "Ares, you seeing this?" Tanaka asked over the internal comm. "Just drive Echo," Miller retorted. "The old lady got you spooked." Tanaka gritted his teeth and eased the heavy MRAP onto the bridge. The structure groaned under the weight. The vehicle was halfway across when the world erupted. The first explosion wasn't the bridge. It was the canyon mouth behind them. A massive IED, perfectly placed, detonated with a deafening roar, sending a landslide of rock and debris cascading down onto the road, sealing their only escape route. Simultaneously, the first RPG struck the lead MRAP. It wasn't a lucky shot. It was a perfect one, impacting the engine block and turning the front of the vehicle into a fireball. The MRAP shuddered to a halt, trapping the second vehicle behind it on the crumbling bridge. Then the shooting started. Tracers, green and angry, stitched the air from dozens of hidden positions high on the canyon walls. Mortar rounds began to fall, their impacts walking closer with terrifying precision. This wasn't a handful of local militia. This was a professional, well-coordinated ambush. The intelligence had been catastrophically wrong. "Contact! Contact!" Miller screamed into the comms. "We're in a kill box, pinned down on the bridge." Another RPG slammed into the rear MRAP, disabling its turret. Heavy machine gun fire raked the vehicles, the heavy-caliber rounds punching through weaker sections of armor. Inside the TOC, the confident atmosphere evaporated, replaced by frantic, panicked shouting. "Get me air support," Vance bellowed. "Negative, sir. Comms are being jammed. Full spectrum," a technician yelled back. "We've lost their video feed. All we have is a blinking GPS tracker." The blinking dot on the map was stationary, right in the middle of the bridge Rostova had warned them about. In the canyon, chaos reigned. Miller, trying to lay down covering fire from the MRAP's hatch, was hit. A piece of shrapnel from a mortar blast tore through his shoulder, sending him tumbling back inside, his arm a useless, bloody mess. Panic began to set in. They were trapped, exposed, and being systematically torn apart. Dr. Thorne, the asset, was screaming, curled into a ball on the floor. "We have to get off this bridge," Tanaka shouted, trying to apply a tourniquet to Miller's arm. "It's gonna collapse." But there was nowhere to go. Ahead, the bridge was failing. Behind, the road was blocked. And all around them, death rained down from the cliffs. The arrogant, invincible warriors of Cerberus Squad were caught in a trap not of their enemies' making, but of their own commander's pride. Their training had prepared them for direct assaults, for kicking down doors and overwhelming an enemy. It had not prepared them for this, to be the nail waiting for the hammer to fall. As the bridge shuddered under another mortar impact, sending cracks spiderwebbing across its surface, Tanaka looked at the terrified faces of his comrades and realized the truth. The supply clerk had been right. They were going to die here. While chaos consumed the TOC, Elena Rostova moved with the placid calm of a river. The frantic shouts of General Vance and his staff were just background noise, a storm she observed from a great distance. Her eyes were fixed on her secondary monitor, which displayed a topographical overlay of the Al-Qashir Gorge. The seismic sensors she had been monitoring had registered the initial IED blast, confirming the enemy had sealed the canyon entrance. Her thermal imaging feed, routed through a high-altitude drone on a non-standard frequency the jammers hadn't targeted, showed dozens of heat signatures blooming on the cliffs. It was a textbook L-shaped ambush. Professional, patient, deadly. She didn't wait for an order. She didn't ask for permission. Vance and his men were paralyzed, staring at a blinking dot on a map. They were trying to solve the problem they had created. Rostova was already focused on the solution. She turned and walked out of the TOC. No one noticed her leave. Her first stop was the comms shack, where she grabbed a PRC-117G radio, a satellite phone, and a small, powerful jammer buster she had personally calibrated. Her next stop was the motor pool. She ignored the gleaming, up-armored vehicles and walked to a forgotten corner where a stripped-down desert patrol vehicle sat under a dusty tarp. It was an old relic, considered too light and vulnerable for modern operations. The mechanics had cannibalized it for parts. But Rostova knew its engine was sound and its fuel tank was full. She had checked it herself 2 days prior. Within 5 minutes, she had hot-wired the engine, which roared to life with a throaty cough. She threw her gear in the passenger seat and sped out of the FOB, not through the main gate, but through a service exit used by water trucks, a route not monitored by the tower. She didn't take the main road. She took the path she had identified earlier, the old, winding service road that snaked through the high desert, parallel to the canyon. The ride was brutal. The vehicle had minimal suspension, and she pushed it to its limits, fishtailing through loose gravel and bouncing over rocks that would have crippled a lesser vehicle or a lesser driver. Her hands on the wheel were steady, her eyes reading the terrain 50 meters ahead, her body moving with the violent jolts, not against them. She drove with a focused intensity, a woman on a singular, urgent purpose. After 20 minutes of bone-jarring travel, she reached a high plateau that overlooked the Al-Qashir Gorge. She killed the engine and coasted the final 100 meters into a cluster of weathered rock formations, a perfect position of concealment. She was a kilometer away from the ambush site and 300 meters above it. She had the high ground. From her rucksack, she retrieved the rifle from the container. It was a heavily modified M21, a weapon from a different era, fitted with a modern optic and a custom-built suppressor that made it look like an ugly, brutalist piece of hardware. She chambered a round of 762mm match-grade ammunition, the click of the bolt echoing softly in the wind. She laid a small canvas mat on the rock, settled behind the rifle, and looked through the scope. The scene below was a diorama of death. The 2 disabled MRAPs were trapped on the bridge, pocked with RPG impacts and shrouded in smoke. She could see the muzzle flashes from the enemy positions. Using a laser rangefinder, she began to map them. 2 heavy machine gun nests on the western ridge. A mortar team on the eastern bluff, just behind a rocky outcrop. And spotters. She saw them immediately, 2-man teams with high-powered optics directing the fire. They were the brain of the operation. She would take them out first. She settled her breathing. In out, the world narrowed to the circle of her scope. The wind was gusting from the northwest at 10 knots. She adjusted for elevation and windage, the calculations happening instantly, an instinct honed over decades. Her first target was a spotter team 950 meters away. The crosshairs settled on the helmet of the man holding the binoculars. She exhaled half a breath, found the natural respiratory pause, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, but the sound was a dull cough, swallowed by the wind. A second later, The spotter's head vanished in a pink mist. His partner looked around in confusion, and before he could raise an alarm, a second round took him in the chest. One brain cell was dead. She shifted her position, her movements fluid and economical. Her next target was the mortar team. They were partially obscured, but she had a clear line of sight to the man dropping rounds into the tube. 1,100 meters. A more difficult shot. She held her breath, waiting for the wind to die down. A lull. She fired. The round struck the mortar tube itself, the impact causing the live round inside to detonate. The resulting explosion ripped through the mortar pit, silencing it permanently. Down in the canyon, the pinned-down soldiers of Cerberus felt the shift. The relentless mortar fire had stopped. Rostova worked methodically, without emotion. She was a surgeon excising a cancer. She took out the 2 heavy machine gun nests with 4 perfect shots, targeting the gunners first, then their assistants. The volume of incoming fire on the MRAPs dropped by half. She then targeted a man with a radio antenna sticking out of his backpack, clearly a communications hub. He fell. She had dismantled the enemy's command structure, sowed chaos in their ranks, and created a window of opportunity. Only then did she reach for her radio. She switched it to Cerberus Squad's encrypted frequency, punching through the jamming with a burst of concentrated power. Her voice, when it came, was calm, clipped, and devoid of the chaos unfolding below. Cerberus, this is Archangel. I've opened your western flank. Pop smoke on my mark. Exfil route is compromised. Follow the dry riverbed north. I will cover your withdrawal. The sudden, clear voice in their headsets was like a miracle. Inside the battered MRAP, Tanaka stared at his radio in disbelief. Who the hell is Archangel? Back in the TOC, the technician's voice cut through the panicked din. Sir, I've got a new signal. It's breaking through the jamming. Patching it through now. Rostova's voice filled the room. Pop smoke on my mark. General Vance stared at the speaker as if it had sprouted a second head. Who is that? Who in the hell is Archangel? He roared, his face purple with rage and confusion. He whirled on his staff. I didn't authorize any support elements. Who is in the field? No one had an answer. The room was a sea of blank, terrified faces. Only one man moved. Colonel Davies, a quiet, older intelligence officer who rarely spoke, was typing furiously at his terminal. His job was to manage the mission's classified electronic files Vance had never bothered to read. He was searching for the operational support roster. The name popped up on his screen, and his blood ran cold. He looked up at Vance, his face pale. General, Archangel is the designated emergency support call sign for this operation. The assigned operator is, he swallowed hard. The operator is Master Sergeant Rostova. Silence descended upon the TOC. The only sound was the faint crackle of the radio. Vance stared at Davies, his mind refusing to process the information. The supply clerk? The old woman he had humiliated? It was impossible. He lunged for the comms panel, shoving the technician aside. Archangel, this is command. Identify yourself. Give me your call sign. Your real call sign. Right now? His voice was a raw, desperate command, the demand of a man whose entire worldview was collapsing. There was a pause on the line. Over the open channel, they heard the dull thump-thump of 2 more suppressed rifle shots. Then, Rostova's voice came back, as flat and cold as a gravestone. Stand by. Another thump. She was still working. Down in the canyon, Tanaka and the remaining able-bodied members of Cerberus were moving, using the lull in enemy fire to pull the wounded, including a semi-conscious Miller and the terrified scientist from the wrecked vehicles. They scrambled down the embankment into the dry riverbed, just as the bridge above them finally gave way with a screech of tortured metal, collapsing into the gorge. On the radio, Rostova's voice returned, cutting through the static. There was no triumph in it, no satisfaction. It was the voice of a professional delivering a report. Command, this is Ghost Viper. Cerberus is on the move. The name hung in the air of the Tactical Operations Center, an obscene, impossible sound. Ghost Viper. It wasn't just a call sign. It was a ghost story, a legend whispered by old intelligence officers and grizzled Special Forces veterans. A Black Ops assassin from the Cold War's darkest, most deniable conflicts. A solo operative credited with dozens of high-profile eliminations and rescues in places the government officially denied ever being. An artist of silent, long-range death who had vanished without a trace over 2 decades ago. Assumed dead or living in quiet obscurity. General Theron Vance froze, his hand hovering over the console. His face, which had been flushed with rage, was now ashen. The blood drained from it, leaving a sickly, gray pallor. He looked at Colonel Davies, whose expression confirmed the terrifying truth. Ghost Viper wasn't a myth. She was a master sergeant in logistics, and he had just sent her soldiers into a trap she had warned him about. The entire room was frozen, the operators and analysts staring at the speaker, their minds reeling. The air of panicked incompetence had been replaced by a thick, suffocating awe. They weren't listening to a supply clerk anymore. They were listening to a legend. Rostova, Ghost Viper, became their lifeline. Her voice was the only point of calm in a world of chaos. Cerberus, move 200 meters north. Take cover behind the large boulder formation on your left. You have one enemy fire team attempting to flank you from the eastern ridge. I am handling it. 3 more quiet coughs from her rifle echoed faintly over the comms, and the flanking fire abruptly ceased. She guided them through the treacherous riverbed with the calm precision of a tour guide, her instructions stripped of all non-essential information. Cross the shallow section now. The ground is more stable on the far side. You have 5 minutes until the enemy can re-establish a firing position on the west ridge. For the men of Cerberus' squad, the transformation was absolute. The arrogant swagger was gone, burned away by terror and replaced by a primal, desperate trust. They followed her directions without question. They were no longer the tip of the spear. They were sheep, and she was the unseen shepherdess guiding them out of the valley of death. Gene Tanaka, now the de facto leader, relayed her commands, his own voice tight with a respect that bordered on religious reverence. He kept glancing up at the silent, empty cliffs, trying to imagine the ghost who was watching over them. Cade Miller, drifting in and out of consciousness from blood loss and pain, heard her voice over the radio. He didn't understand the call sign, but he understood the tone. It was the voice of pure, unshakable competence. The same calm, level tone she had used when telling him his ammunition was faulty. He felt a profound, burning shame that was sharper than the shrapnel in his shoulder. The trek was an agonizing ordeal. They half-carried, half-dragged their wounded comrades over loose rock and uneven ground. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat, but every time a new enemy position opened up on them, it was silenced almost immediately by a single, precise shot from nowhere. Rostova was their guardian angel, her rifle a divine instrument of judgment. After 2 grueling hours, they reached the designated secondary extraction point, a small, flat clearing Rostova had directed them to. It was far from the original LZ, in a location their pursuers would never anticipate. As they collapsed, exhausted and bleeding, they heard the distant but growing thwump 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 of inbound helicopters. Rostova had arranged it all. Using the satellite phone, she had bypassed the jammed local channels and the panicked command structure at the FOB, contacting regional command directly. She had given them the new coordinates, the number of wounded, and the required medical support, her report a model of clarity and efficiency. When the Black Hawks landed, kicking up a storm of dust and debris, the ramp dropped to reveal not just medics, but General Vance himself. His face was a grim, unreadable mask. He watched as the battered and bloodied soldiers of his prized unit were loaded aboard. The last person to emerge from the rocks was Rostova. She moved out of the shadows, her rifle held loosely at her side. She wasn't winded. She wasn't covered in sweat. She looked like she had just returned from a brisk walk. She nodded to the medics to see to Miller, her expression revealing nothing. As she walked toward the helicopter, her path took her directly past General Vance. He stood rigidly, his posture ramrod straight. The men of Cerberus' squad, those who could stand, watched from the helicopter ramp. Tanaka, Miller, and the others. Their faces were a mixture of awe, gratitude, and shame. Vance did not speak. Words were inadequate. They were pointless. His arrogance had nearly cost these men their lives. Her quiet competence had saved them. As Rostova drew level with him, he did the only thing he could. He raised his hand to his brow in a slow, formal salute. It wasn't the perfunctory gesture a general gives a subordinate. It was a salute of profound, soul-deep respect. Acknowledgement. Apology. Rostova paused for a fraction of a second, met his gaze with her steady gray eyes, and gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. It was all the acknowledgement he would get. It was more than he deserved. Then, from the ramp of the helicopter, Gene Tanaka, his uniform torn and stained with Miller's blood, raised his own hand in a salute. One by one, the other members of Cerberus' squad followed suit. They saluted the quiet, gray-haired master sergeant, the logistics clerk, the ghost who had walked out of the pages of legend to pull them from their graves. Rostova boarded the helicopter without a backward glance, the engines spooling up to carry them away from the canyon of their hubris. Hours later, the adrenaline had faded, leaving behind the dull ache of exhaustion and the bitter taste of failure. FOB Nightingale was quiet, the frantic energy of the morning replaced by a somber, reflective mood. The wounded were in the medical tent, the debriefings were underway, and the official reports were already being written, carefully worded to obscure the near disaster. General Vance had locked himself in his office. The men of Cerberus' squad were confined to their barracks, left to lick their wounds and grapple with the humbling events of the day. The base had moved on, but for those who had been in the canyon or the TOC, the world had fundamentally shifted. The name Ghost Viper was now spoken only in hushed, reverent whispers. Gene Tanaka couldn't rest. The image of Rostova's calm face, the sound of her steady voice over the comms, was burned into his mind. He needed to understand. He left the barracks and began to search for her, not in the command tents or the mess hall, but in the quiet, forgotten corners of the base. He found her in a cavernous, poorly lit maintenance bay at the far edge of the airfield. The air inside smelled of diesel, grease, and old metal. She was alone, sitting on an overturned supply crate under the dim glow of a single bare bulb. Before her, on a clean canvas cloth, lay the pieces of her M21 rifle. She was cleaning it. There was a ritualistic quality to her movements. Her hands, which he had once seen as old and frail, moved with a surgeon's precision. She methodically disassembled the bolt, wiping each component with an oil-soaked rag, her focus absolute. She used a brass brush to scrub the carbon from the chamber, her motions patient and practiced. This wasn't just maintenance. It was a meditation, a communion between a warrior and her tool. Tanaka stood in the doorway for a long moment, just watching. She didn't seem to notice him, or if she did, she gave no sign. She was in her own world, a place of discipline and quiet purpose that he felt he had only just glimpsed. He thought of all the things he wanted to say. "Thank you, I'm sorry, who are you?" But the words felt clumsy and insufficient. They would break the sanctity of the moment. Instead, he walked over to a stack of crates, pulled one up near her, and sat down. He unslung his own rifle, the modern, modular M4 carbine that felt like a child's toy next to her old warhorse. He hesitated for a second, then began to break it down. He mimicked her movements. He popped the receiver pins and separated the upper from the lower. He pulled out the bolt carrier group and began to wipe it down, his own motions feeling awkward and rushed compared to her fluid economy. They didn't speak. Not a single word passed between them. The only sounds were the soft scrape of the cleaning rods, the gentle click of metal parts being inspected and reassembled, and the whisper of oiled rags on steel. It was a silent conversation. In that shared ritual, Tanaka was offering the only thing he could, a quiet admission of respect. He was acknowledging her world, her discipline, her mastery. He was no longer the cocky special operator. He was the student, sitting at the feet of the master, learning a lesson that had nothing to do with shooting and everything to do with what it meant to be a true soldier. As they worked, the first rays of the new day began to filter through the grimy windows of the bay, cutting through the darkness and dust motes. The sun rose over the distant, jagged peaks, casting long shadows across the airfield. The night was over. A new day had begun, cleansed by the night's fire and sacrifice. And in the quiet hum of the dawning world, the silent sounds of two soldiers cleaning their weapons became a hymn to survival, a promise of duty, and a testament to respect, earned not with words, but with deeds.